I'm Marion Weston. I'm 72, and I never thought I'd hear my own son's voice low and unfamiliar through the kitchen wall on a Tuesday morning. There was the sound of running water, the rattle of mugs. Then Claire's voice, sharper than I remembered saying, "Her mind's too far gone. It's only a matter of time." I stood just outside the doorway, listening to my family talk about me as if I wasn't just down the hall, as if my feet hadn't walked these floors for 40 years. Ethan laughed, easy, careless. "Just keep her from the phone. It'll be over soon." My hands didn't shake. I looked at the back of my own reflection in the glass door, searching for any sign I'd faded. But all I found was the woman who built this home still standing. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And if you've ever had family treat you like a burden, hit that like and subscribe button. I grew up in Pennsylvania coal country, in a house where you took care of your own and never locked the front door. My father George taught me how to split wood before I was tall enough to reach the latch. My mother Helen was a nurse who washed her uniforms by hand, said grace at every meal, and measured people by their kindness. The world felt smaller than honest with neighbors who brought casseroles in winter and looked out for each other's children. When I married Frank Weston, I moved to a brick house just a few miles from where I was raised. Frank was a carpenter with a laugh that filled every room. We saved and stretched every dollar, built our life around steady work, church on Sundays, and birthday parties where I baked the cake from scratch. I went back to school late in life, got my law degree at 42, and opened a small practice out of our dining room. I never thought of myself as powerful, just careful, just prepared. Our son Ethan was born after years of hope and heartbreak. We raised him to be gentle, to listen before he spoke. He was bright but soft-spoken, always preferred a book to a football. Maybe that's why after Frank passed, I tried to make sure Ethan never had to worry, never had to fight for anything. He went off to college, met Claire, and brought her home one Thanksgiving. She was all confidence, perfume, and ambition, the kind of woman who straightened picture frames that weren't crooked. When my health took a turn after a small stroke, Ethan and Claire moved in just to help, they said. At first, it was small. Claire offered to sort the mail. Ethan handled the bank statements. I told myself it was temporary. But as the weeks passed, the rhythm of the house changed. Drawers were emptied, old photos disappeared from the mantel. My calendar filled up with appointments I didn't make. Every day brought another gentle reminder. "Let us take care of it, Mom. Just rest." Sometimes, late at night, I'd sit by the window and watch the lights from passing cars on Maple Street. The world outside, carrying on as if nothing had changed. But inside, I was starting to feel like a guest in my own home. Even my garden, once wild with tomatoes and basil, now sat untouched. The gate locked with a padlock I didn't buy. I wanted to believe the best, to trust in family. But that morning by the kitchen, something shifted. Claire's words cut through the quiet, colder than January wind. For a moment, I almost let myself drift. But then I remembered who I was and what I'd built. I slipped back to my room, pulled open the drawer where I'd kept my old black notebook, and started writing things down again, just like I used to. I could hear them laughing in the living room, the sound bouncing down the hall like nothing was wrong. But I knew, even if I hadn't quite figured out how deep it went yet, and that's how it started. The day I realized I wasn't just fading, I was about to fight for everything I had left. It was a Wednesday when I opened the kitchen drawer and saw my checkbook was gone. Claire noticed me standing there and said she'd put it somewhere safe, her voice as bright as the afternoon sun streaming through the window. I nodded and reached for a dish towel, drying my hands just to give them something to do. Later that same day, I found a health journal open behind the scissors, red ink, circling phrases like possible memory lapse and confused about medication schedule. That was her handwriting, not mine. The next morning, Ethan was hunched over the table, brushing crumbs from his slacks, barely looking up when I asked if a tax document had arrived. "Let Claire handle the bills, Mom," he said, tapping away on his phone. "You should be relaxing." I watched him for a while, remembering all the evenings he'd fallen asleep with his head in my lap, too tired to finish his homework. He looked older now, more distant, but when he finally glanced at me, it was clear he thought he was helping. Maybe that was the worst part, how easy it was for him to believe that. The days started to blend. Claire took over answering the phone and started opening the mail before I even touched it. When I mentioned it, she smiled, told me I was just worrying too much, and patted my arm with a sympathy I didn't want. Sometimes I'd find a pile of mail on the table already opened and sorted the envelopes stacked in a way that made it clear which ones she wanted me to read. The rest would disappear before I could even ask. I tried to reclaim small routines, a call to the garden service, a trip to the pharmacy. But Claire always had a reason why it wasn't necessary. "It's too expensive, Marion," she'd say, or "I already picked up your prescription, don't worry." She never raised her voice, never argued. She just handled, always smiling, always just a little too close. I noticed changes in the house itself. Old photos vanished from the living room shelves. The good dishes were packed away. My own calendar, where I used to track birthdays and appointments in blue ink, was replaced by a new one, printed filled out by Claire in tight, neat handwriting. I tried to keep up, but every time I turned around, it felt like another piece of my life was being boxed up or hidden away. One afternoon, I sat in the garden, pulling at the sleeves of my cardigan, feeling the rough edges of the old patio chair beneath me. The wisteria I'd planted when Ethan was a boy was climbing wild, but I hadn't trimmed it since before the stroke. The shears were gone from the shed. The gate to the backyard was locked with a new padlock. Claire brought me tea, placed a blanket over my lap, and sat beside me, her own plate of salad untouched. "Dr. Henley said there'd be good days like this," she said, watching me. "The lucidity comes and goes." I let her talk, her words hanging in the warm air, thick as humidity before a summer storm. Later, I found myself standing in front of the hall mirror, looking at my reflection and wondering when I'd started to disappear. My mother's brooch was gone from the tray where I kept my jewelry. "I put it in the safe," Claire said when I asked. "Just for now." Ethan wandered in from the den, handed me a mug of coffee, and kissed my forehead. "How's my girl today?" His voice was light, like it was all a game, like he was talking to a child. I managed a smile, let him think it was enough. Nights were the worst. I'd hear Claire on the phone in the kitchen, her voice low, sometimes urgent. The words were always the same. "She's tired. She's confused. It's just a matter of time." Once she mentioned my name, then paused and whispered, "She doesn't even know what day it is anymore." I stood in the hallway, hidden by the half-open door, listening to the way my life was being rewritten, piece by piece, in a language that sounded like care, but felt like theft. The first time I found a document I didn't recognize, it was buried in a stack of mail on my nightstand. The paper was heavy cream-colored, embossed with gold at the top. I unfolded it carefully. The words, "Whitlow Family Trust," jumped out at me. My name was printed, but underneath, in smaller letters, was a signature that looked almost right. I held it up to the lamp, studying the curve of the G in grace, the swoop of the W close, but not mine. My hands shook, but only for a moment. I tucked the document into a folder marked E.G. Whitlow Contingency, the one I'd kept since the days when I drafted my first will. That night, I went up to the attic, moving slower than I once did, but still sure-footed enough to pull open the old cedar chest. Inside were the papers that mattered: law credentials, my notary stamp, and the original family trust, yellowed but intact. I checked every page, every clause, the old notes in my handwriting, the signatures witnessed by Henry Duval. I compared them line by line to the new document. The differences weren't obvious, but they were there. Clauses missing, titles shifted. My name crossed out and rewritten with a lighter hand. The dates didn't line up. I sat back on the attic floor, the air thick with dust and memory, and realized what had happened. This wasn't just a mistake. This was something else, something that took what I'd built and tried to make it someone else's. A few days later, I watched Claire set out breakfast, her movements crisp and practiced. She handed me a pill I didn't recognize and said it was from Dr. Caldwell. I didn't argue. I just set it aside, kept my eyes steady. Later, I slipped the pill into a plastic bag and tucked it into the freezer. A small act that felt like drawing a line in the sand. Ethan came in from the porch, smiling, telling me not to worry, that everything was under control. I sat on the edge of my bed, my notebook open, writing down every detail, the time, the faces, what was said. I even started recording my voice, just in case. "This is Marion Weston," I said quietly, "and I am of sound mind." It didn't take long before I realized I wasn't just being helped. I was being handled. Calls were rerouted, mail redirected, accounts updated without my consent. Whenever I questioned a change, Claire would smile, tilt her head, and speak slowly as if I might break. "It's all for your own good, Marion," she'd say, her words carefully chosen. "Just let us handle things." I began to remember stories from my old law clients. Widows and widowers, whose families took over everything for their safety. How easy it had been to lose control of their lives, one quiet compromise at a time. Now I understood in a way I never had before. Every step they took away from me was small, polite, wrapped in kindness that didn't feel kind at all. One evening, as the sun set behind the maple trees, Ethan stood by the window looking out at the yard. "Claire says we should cancel the garden service," he said, not meeting my eyes. "It's too expensive, and you don't really need it anymore." I nodded, letting the silence hang between us. I waited until the house was quiet, then crept up to the attic again. I found an old audio recorder and pressed the button, the tape crackling to life. I spoke clearly, documenting the dates and the changes, making sure there would be a record if anyone cared to listen. I didn't sleep much after that. There was too much to remember, too much to keep straight. I spent hours sorting files, making copies, hiding notes in places I knew Claire wouldn't find. I started to see every conversation as a negotiation, every smile as a test. I let them think I was fading, but I watched and waited, collecting every piece of evidence I could. The morning that Claire mentioned simplifying the estate, her tone was light, but her eyes were cold. "It'll be easier for everyone, Marion," she said, laying a folder on the table. "Just a few signatures. We can handle the rest." I opened the folder, scanned the pages, and closed it again, my hands steady. "I'll need to look this over," I said, my voice even. She nodded, not pushing, but I could feel her watching me as I tucked the folder away. That night, I sat at my desk with a fresh sheet of paper and wrote out everything I could remember: the first missing bank statement, the unreturned phone calls the day the notary stamp went missing. I signed my name at the bottom the same way I had for clients all those years ago. I placed the letter in a sealed envelope, wrote, "In case of emergency," across the front, and hid it in the drawer beneath my winter scarves. As the days stretched on, the house grew quieter. Claire and Ethan spent more time behind closed doors, their voices low and tense. Sometimes I'd hear them arguing, Ethan's voice worried, Claire's sharp and impatient. "She's slipping," Claire would say. "It's only a matter of time." I listened, my heart steady, my mind clear. One morning, I woke early before the sun was up and walked through the silent house. The floors creaked beneath my feet, the air cool against my skin. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, listening to the refrigerator hum and the world outside waking up. The house was still mine, even if it didn't feel like it anymore. As I sat there, watching the light change, I realized I wasn't alone. Other people had gone through this. Other women had been told they were confused, had their lives taken from them piece by piece under the guise of love. I wasn't the first, and I wouldn't be the last. But I would be ready. The days slipped past, slow and silent. I woke each morning to the hush of the house sunlight pushing through the curtains, the clock ticking on the mantel like a metronome counting out the emptiness. Even with Ethan and Claire moving from room to room, the air felt heavy with something unspoken. Some afternoons I'd hear their laughter from the living room, and for a moment it almost sounded normal, like any other family's noise. But there was a hollow edge to it. I could sit at the kitchen table and hear them talking just out of earshot, the way you can sense a storm on the horizon before it breaks. Routine took on new meaning. My cup of tea, made the same way I'd done for years, tasted different. I started taking meals in my bedroom more often, tray balanced on my lap, the hall door locked behind me. It was the only place I felt like myself. I wrote in my notebook every evening, recording the details. I didn't want to forget the times Claire had handled my medication the morning the garden gate was locked. The odd look on Ethan's face when I asked about my checkbook. I hid the notebook in the lining of my coat, the one I used to wear to the courthouse when I still practiced law. Some days, I wore it inside just to remind myself that I could. The house changed around me, growing quieter in ways that had nothing to do with sound. My phone disappeared from my nightstand one morning, and when I asked Claire, she smiled and handed it back, telling me she'd been charging it. My iPad reset itself. The passcode changed to something I didn't know. "Let me handle it, Marion," she said, her voice light, but her hand already reaching for the device. "You shouldn't worry about things like that." It was small, ordinary moments that caught me off guard. The slip of paper missing from my calendar, the smell of furniture polish when Claire cleared out my old filing cabinet, the way Ethan's eyes darted to Claire before answering my questions. At night, I'd stand at my bedroom window and watch the lights from the cars along Maple Street, the red glow weaving through the dark. Sometimes I'd press my hand to the glass just to feel the coolness, to remind myself that I was still here. I started forgetting things, but only on the outside. I played along when Claire asked what day it was, let my voice trail off as if I was lost in thought. She would nod and jot something in her journal, her pen scratching out a record of confusion and forgetfulness. But inside, my mind was sharp, following every detail, every whisper, collecting evidence as quietly as I could. I remembered stories of my old clients, how families could smile and say, "Just rest," while rearranging everything behind closed doors. Sometimes Ethan would linger in the kitchen after dinner, his hand resting on the back of a chair. He'd ask if I needed anything. His words too careful, eyes flicking to the door where Claire might appear at any moment. "You look tired, Mom," he'd say. Maybe an early night I'd nod and let him believe I was fading, even as I made note of the time, the look on his face, the weight in his shoulders. My world shrank to a handful of rooms, each one a little less familiar. The guest room, once filled with quilts and photographs, was now an office for Claire, her papers stacked on the desk, her laptop open late into the night. The hallway, once lined with family pictures, was bare except for a single framed print Claire insisted looked modern. I spent more time in my bedroom, locking the door behind me, sorting through old documents, making copies, hiding notes in the sleeves of jackets and between the pages of books. One afternoon, Claire brought me tea and set a blanket across my legs. Her movements practiced her smile, just a little too bright. She started talking about how the house was too much for me now, how she and Ethan could take care of everything if I'd just let go a little more. "It's only temporary," she said, her voice low and soothing. "You deserve to rest, Marion." I looked at her hands, steady, sure never trembling, and thought about all the things that had vanished from my world without a sound. At night, I lay awake, listening to the quiet. The walls seemed thinner than before the darkness pressed close. Sometimes I'd hear Claire's voice hushed and hurried, talking on the phone in the next room. "She's slipping. It's just a matter of time." I closed my eyes and let the words drift past, holding tight to the memories I still had. I kept writing in my notebook, filling the pages with names, dates, snippets of conversation, anything that might matter. I made audio recordings on the old device from the attic, speaking clearly, documenting each day. "This is Marion Weston," I'd say. "I am of sound mind." It was the only way I could be sure that if it ever came to a fight, there would be a record. There were moments, especially in the early mornings, when I felt like a stranger in my own home. The light would come in through the window and settle on the kitchen counter, and I'd stand there, trying to remember the last time I felt truly at ease. I missed the days when I could open the back door and smell the earth after a rain, when I could find my garden shears without having to ask. I missed the small freedoms, the sound of my own voice on the phone, the keys in my purse, the comfort of knowing every inch of this place belonged to me. Still, I held on. Even as my world grew smaller, I clung to the routines I could manage. I made my own coffee every morning, even when Claire tried to insist otherwise. I arranged my closet, folded my sweaters, tucked notes into the lining, just in case. The house might not feel like mine anymore, but I refused to let go completely. One evening after dinner, Ethan lingered at the table, his plate barely touched. He glanced at me, then at Claire, his words slow and uncertain. "Are you sure you're okay, Mom?" I smiled and reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm just a little tired, that's all." He nodded, but the worry stayed in his eyes. Claire watched us, her lips pressed tight, her fingers tapping on the arm of her chair. As the sun set and the house settled into quiet, I walked down the hall to my room, my steps steady. I closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed, the old notebook open in my lap. I listened to the muffled sounds of their voices drifting down the hallway. For the first time in weeks, I felt the shape of a plan forming, not all at once, but slowly, like the way the first light creeps across a bedroom floor at dawn. There was a kind of comfort in the stillness, even as the world I'd known seemed to slip farther away. I was not gone, not yet. I would keep watching, keep writing, keep recording, even if no one noticed but me. And as I listened to the quiet of the house, I promised myself I would not let the silence swallow me whole. Tomorrow, I would begin to gather what I needed, even if I had to do it one hidden note at a time. That next morning, I woke before dawn. The sky was still dark, a thin blue line just beginning to touch the edge of the window. I moved quietly through the house, careful not to wake Claire or Ethan. My steps felt steadier than they had in weeks. I brewed a pot of coffee, poured myself a cup, and sat at the kitchen table listening to the low hum of the refrigerator. The quiet felt different, full, not empty. I set my notebook on the table and flipped through the pages, rereading the details I'd written down in my own steady handwriting. Every date, every conversation, every change. It was all there. I looked up and saw my reflection in the kitchen window, half shadow, half light. For the first time in a long while, I saw the woman who built this house and raised a son. I saw someone who had not been erased. I set my coffee down and went to my bedroom, opened the closet, and reached for the small box I'd kept tucked behind my winter boots. Inside were the documents that mattered most. Original trust will power of attorney, my handwriting crisp and sure. I gathered them together, then added the recent records copies of the new trust, the notary seal I didn't recognize, Claire's health journal entries, a printed transcript of the voice recordings I'd made on the old tape player from the attic. I ran my fingers over each page, careful and slow. Mid-morning, when the sun was warm on the front walk, I put on my cardigan and slipped the folder into my purse. "I'm going for a walk," I called down the hallway. Claire, half distracted, told me to take my phone. I told her I'd be back soon. I made my way out the front door, past the porch with the loose floorboard, and walked 2 blocks to the bus stop. The bus rumbled up the street, and I climbed aboard, finding a seat near the window. For the first time in weeks, no one asked where I was going or when I'd be back. At the next stop, I got off and crossed Main Street to a small brick building with a brass plaque that read, "Duval and Harper Attorneys at Law." Inside, the waiting room smelled faintly of lemon polish and old books. Henry Duval, my former colleague, came out to greet me. He looked older, slower, but his eyes were sharp the way I remembered from long days in court. "Marion," he said, "it's good to see you." I handed him the folder. He glanced at the documents, his brow furrowing as he flipped through the pages. I sat quietly while he read, letting the silence stretch between us. He looked up after a long moment, his voice low and certain. "They've overplayed their hand," he said. "We can do something about this, but you'll need to be patient." I nodded, grateful for the calm steadiness in his tone. We talked about next steps, what evidence he needed, what I should document, who to trust. He told me to keep my notes detailed and to avoid using the house phone. He would reach out to an independent psychiatric evaluator, someone I could trust, not one of Claire's referrals. Before I left, he pressed my hand. "You're not alone," he said, "and you're not finished." I stepped back out into the sunlight, my heart beating steady and slow. Back at the house, the afternoon passed in quiet routine. Claire asked if I wanted to try a new medication. Her voice too cheerful, eyes too watchful. I smiled, set the pill aside, and wrote the name down in my notebook. Ethan came in later, asked how my walk had gone, and I told him it cleared my head. He seemed relieved, maybe a little distracted. I watched the way his shoulders hunched, the way he avoided looking me in the eye. It was hard not to remember the boy he used to be, quick to laugh, always ready with a question. Now he seemed caught in someone else's current, carried along by decisions he didn't want to make. The next morning, Henry called and told me the evaluation was set for the following week. "Be yourself," he said. "Answer honestly. Don't hide anything, but don't let anyone convince you you're confused." I thanked him, wrote the appointment down, and set a reminder in my calendar. That afternoon, I went for another walk, this time to a small clinic on the other side of town. The doctor who greeted me was young, careful with his words and gentle in his questions. He had me count backward by Seven's name, state capitals, draw a clock face from memory. I finished the tests, hands steady, voice clear. He offered to send a copy of the evaluation to my lawyer and let me know I could request the results myself if I wanted. I thanked him and left my steps a little lighter than before. Days passed, each one marked by small, quiet actions. I checked the mail every afternoon, made copies of every letter I didn't recognize, and hid them in the lining of my old coat. I bought a prepaid cell phone at the grocery store and kept it charged and hidden in a shoebox beneath my bed. I started making audio recordings every night, stating the date, what had happened, and how I felt. "This is Marion Weston," I said into the recorder, "and I am of sound mind and memory." I watched Claire more closely, noticing how her voice changed when she talked to Ethan, the way she lingered by the medicine cabinet, how her hand rested on the back of my chair, just a little too long. She started asking odd questions. "Do you remember what day it is, Marion? Did you take your meds this morning?" Each time I answered, slowly letting my eyes drift, just confused enough to satisfy her. One evening, after dinner, I sat at the kitchen table, notebook, open, the weight of the day pressing on my shoulders. Ethan came in, rubbing the back of his neck, looking uncertain. He sat down across from me quiet for a long time before he spoke. "Is there anything you want to tell me, Mom?" he asked, his voice soft. I looked at him, searching his face for some sign of the boy I remembered. "I'm just tired," I said. He nodded, not quite convinced, then stood and left the room. Later that night, I sat in bed, the lamp casting a warm glow across the blankets. I thought about Ada Finley, an old client who'd walked into my office years ago with a folder full of documents determined to protect what she'd built. I remembered how she'd fought to keep her independence, even as her family tried to take it all away. I remembered the fear in her eyes when she realized she was being slowly erased by people she loved. It was the memory of Ada, her strength, her resolve that settled something in me that night. I would not go quietly. I would not be erased. As I drifted to sleep, notebook still open beside me, I made a quiet promise to myself. Tomorrow, I would do more than just watch and wait. Tomorrow, I would start laying the foundation for what came next. And as the house settled into darkness, I listened to the soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a train passing beyond the trees, and let my mind settle on the first true steps of resistance. The following morning, the house felt unusually still. I moved through my routine with care, making coffee, opening the curtains, watching the sparrows gather on the feeder outside. My notebook was tucked in my cardigan pocket, along with the small prepaid cell phone I'd hidden away. Claire and Ethan were still asleep when I slipped out the back door, closing it gently behind me. The sidewalk was slick with last night's rain, and the air held the promise of change. I walked down Maple Street to the little corner pharmacy, keeping my steps slow and even. The familiar bell chimed above the door, and I greeted the clerk by name, just as I always had. I bought a bottle of aspirin and a crossword puzzle book, but what I really needed was the payphone near the entrance. I dialed Henry's number from memory, letting the line ring twice, then hanging up a signal we'd agreed on years ago when we worked together. 2 minutes later, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I answered softly, turning away from the window. Henry's voice was quiet, direct. He told me the evaluation results were already in, that the independent psychiatrist's report confirmed I was of sound mind and memory. He said the next step was to keep everything documented and ready, and to wait for his word. I thanked him and tucked the phone away, relief steadying my hands as I left the store. Back home, I found Claire in the kitchen pouring orange juice, her face pleasant as ever. She glanced up, noting the bag in my hand. Out early, she asked, her tone light. "Just needed some fresh air," I replied, setting the aspirin on the counter. She watched me for a moment, then smiled and turned back to the sink. I sat at the table, flipping through my notebook, marking the date and time, recording the details of my outing and the conversation with Henry. I was careful, methodical, writing only what was necessary. Ethan came in a few minutes later, hair still damp from his shower. He made coffee, humming a tune I couldn't place, and didn't notice when Claire slipped a small pill bottle into her purse. I watched them both, memorizing their movements, their quiet routines. Everything seemed ordinary, but I could feel something building beneath the surface. At lunch, Claire suggested we go through my medications together. "It's just to keep everything organized," she said, her voice cheerful, eyes fixed on mine. I nodded, letting her lay out the bottles and count the pills. She explained each one, naming the doctors and dosages, her words practiced and calm. When she finished, she reached for a new prescription, a small blue capsule I'd never seen before. "This one is from Dr. Caldwell," she said. "It'll help you rest." I picked up the bottle, turning it in my hands, reading the label. I set it down, looked her in the eye, and said, "Let's wait until I talk to Dr. Caldwell myself." Her smile faded for a moment, then returned, but her fingers tightened around the bottle as she put it away. That afternoon, I called Lydia, my niece, using the prepaid phone. I kept the conversation light, asking about her job, her garden, the weather in Ohio. Before hanging up, I asked if she could send me a copy of the photo from last Christmas, the one where she and I were standing on the porch, arms around each other. She agreed without hesitation, and I felt a quiet reassurance settle in my chest. Lydia was someone I could trust, someone who'd stood by me long before all this began. When dinner came, I set the table myself, choosing the plates with blue flowers, the ones Claire always thought were too old-fashioned. I cooked chicken and vegetables the way Frank used to like, and served it with cornbread fresh from the oven. Claire complimented the meal. Ethan thanked me, and for a brief moment, we almost felt like a family again. But under the surface, the distance remained, each of us holding our own silence. That night, I made another recording on the old tape player describing the events of the day, the medications, the phone call with Lydia. "This is Marion Weston," I said, documenting the date, time, and what I observed. I placed the recorder back in the drawer, with the rest of the evidence, careful to keep everything in order. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the rain on the roof, the soft creak of the house as it settled. I thought about Ada, about my clients, who'd fought so hard to keep their voices heard. I thought about Henry's words, "You're not alone, and you're not finished." That promise echoed in my mind as I drifted to sleep, steadied by the knowledge that my first steps had been taken. The next morning, Claire asked if I wanted to review my will. "It's just a formality," she said, placing a folder in front of me at breakfast. I opened it, scanned the pages, and noticed the changes: her name, Ethan's name, the absence of Lydia, the disappearance of all the charities I'd supported for years. I closed the folder, slid it back toward her, and said, "I'll need some time to think." She smiled, but her jaw tightened as she gathered up the papers. Later, I called Henry again, using the same payphone. I gave him the update, told him about the new will, the medication, the small details that didn't fit. He listened, then told me to keep holding steady, that he was almost ready with the next step. "Just keep watching," he said, "and trust yourself." As the days passed, I kept to my routines, but I moved through them with a new sense of purpose. I wrote in my notebook every day, recorded my voice every night, and made copies of any document I didn't recognize. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, made sure my important files were hidden where only I could find them. Every action felt deliberate, every small step a piece of something larger. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the air grew cool, I stood by the kitchen window, looking out over the garden. The wisteria was blooming again, purple and wild, climbing over the old lattice. I reached for my notebook, flipped to a clean page, and began to write out a list: names, dates, questions to ask, things to remember. I wrote slowly, letting the quiet fill the room, the gentle ticking of the clock marking the passing of time. The next day, I received a letter from the clinic confirming my evaluation results. I read the words twice, steady and clear. No evidence of cognitive impairment. I folded the letter, placed it in my file, and felt a small, quiet victory settle over me. With every careful note, every recorded conversation, every phone call made in secret, I felt myself growing stronger. The house was still full of shadows, but I had learned how to move in them, how to shape them to my advantage. By the end of that week, I knew I wasn't just enduring anymore. I was preparing, gathering every piece I'd need for what was coming. And as I turned off the light that night, I promised myself I would not back down, no matter how many steps it took. I lay in the quiet, waiting for the moment the tide would finally shift, knowing that soon Claire and Ethan would realize I hadn't given up anything at all. The night before, everything changed. I couldn't sleep. The rain had come again, steady against the roof, and the shadows on the ceiling moved with every passing car. I lay there thinking of all the days I'd spent gathering notes and hiding documents, all the small actions that had become the framework of my days. Around midnight, I rose and walked the hallway, pausing by the guest room where Claire and Ethan slept. I could hear Claire's voice through the door, hushed and tense. She was talking about court dates and recommendations, whispering about just a little longer, like I was some final piece of business to be handled. I kept moving, making sure the front door was locked, then checked the envelope with my evidence in the bottom drawer. Everything was still where I'd left it. By morning, the rain had stopped, and the house felt strangely still. At breakfast, Claire handed me a cup of tea, setting it down with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Ethan sat beside her, his face pale, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his napkin. I sipped the tea, let the silence stretch, and waited. When I finished, Claire laid a folder beside my plate. "We just want what's best for you, Marion," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "There are a few forms to make everything easier. We can go over them now if you're ready." I opened the folder and scanned the pages, seeing her name and Ethan's, the lines that would sign over my home, my accounts, my life. I closed the folder and looked at her, then at Ethan. "I'd like to wait for my attorney," I said. Claire stiffened, but Ethan just looked away. That afternoon, Henry called to say the judge had set a date for the guardianship hearing. He told me to have everything ready, the recordings, the evaluation, the original trust, the list of every change Claire had made. "Stay steady," he said. "You've done everything right." I hung up and spent the next hour making copies, organizing every piece into a folder marked with my name in block letters. I tucked it into my purse, feeling the weight of it heavy but sure. The hearing was set for the following week. The days leading up to it passed in a quiet blur. Claire hovered, checking my medication, double-checking my calendar, reminding me of every small thing as if I might forget. Ethan kept to himself, spending long hours in his office, coming down only for meals. I stayed to my routine, making notes, recording my voice each night, careful to act as if nothing had changed. But inside, I felt the shift, the quiet certainty that something was coming, and that I was ready for it. On the morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully, choosing my blue skirt and white blouse, the ones I used to wear to court. I brushed my hair, put on a little lipstick, and took a deep breath before walking down the stairs. Henry was waiting in the driveway, his old sedan idling by the curb. He opened the door for me, and I climbed in, holding my folder tight against my chest. As we drove downtown, he went over the plan calm and steady, as if we were preparing for any other case. "You know the facts," he said. "Let the truth do the work." The courthouse was cool and quiet, the hallways echoing with footsteps. We sat on a hard wooden bench, the folder between us, waiting for our turn. Claire and Ethan arrived together, dressed in their best. Claire's expression was careful, her smile practiced. Ethan looked tired, glancing around the waiting area like he wished he was anywhere else. The judge called us in, and we took our seats at the front of the small courtroom. Henry spoke first, laying out the timeline, my medical evaluations, the forged documents, the changes to my accounts, the pattern of control that had built up over months. He presented the folder of evidence, the recordings, the psychiatrist's letter. The judge listened quietly, taking notes. Then it was Claire's turn. She spoke about her concern, her care, the ways she'd tried to help. She described me as forgetful, confused, in need of protection. Ethan sat beside her silent, his eyes fixed on his hands. When the judge asked if I wanted to speak, I stood feeling the steady strength in my legs. I spoke clearly, reciting the facts, the days things went missing, the medication changes, the phone calls I never received, the moment I found my signature forged on the new trust. I read from my notes, my voice steady, and handed the judge a copy of my evaluation stamped and signed by an independent doctor. I am of sound mind and memory, I said, and I know what has happened in my own home. There was a silence after I finished, long and heavy. The judge turned to Henry, asking about the original trust, the legal chain of events. Henry answered every question with practiced ease, laying out the pattern of fraud and coercion. Claire tried to interrupt, but the judge held up a hand. When it was over, he announced his decision. The guardianship petition was denied. My legal rights were restored. The documents forged by Claire were voided, and an investigation into financial abuse was ordered. In that moment, the weight that had pressed on me for months seemed to lift, replaced by something like relief. Claire sat frozen, her eyes wide, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. Ethan slumped in his chair, silent, his face drained of color. Henry packed up the folder, handed me a copy, and nodded, his eyes shining with quiet pride. We left the courthouse as the noon bells rang. I stepped outside, the sun warm on my face, and breathed in the clean air. Henry offered to drive me home, but I asked if we could take the long way past the church, the school, the park where I used to walk with Frank. The world felt both changed and unchanged, as if I was seeing it for the first time after a long winter. At home, the house was still. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood at the kitchen window, watching the wind move through the branches of the old maple. My hands were steady as I set the mug on the counter. For the first time in a long time, I felt the ground beneath my feet solid and sure. And as the afternoon sun drifted across the floorboards, I knew there was still more to come. Consequences, decisions, and the quiet settling of what had been shaken. But for that moment, I let myself breathe, knowing the tide had finally turned. The news spread through the house in a quiet wave. That afternoon, Claire and Ethan came home together. I was sitting in the living room, sunlight slanting through the windows, the original trust, and Henry's business card resting on the coffee table. Claire hesitated in the doorway, her purse clutched tight to her side. Ethan trailed behind her head, lowered his hand, barely brushing the doorknob before letting it go. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The sound of a car passing on Maple Street filled the silence. Officer Delaney from the County Elder Protection Unit arrived, first, clipboard tucked under his arm. Face careful but direct. He greeted me and then turned to Claire, reading out the court's findings. Henry stood beside me, steady as always, watching the scene unfold without a hint of triumph. Ms. Whitlow, Officer Delaney said, you are being placed under arrest for financial fraud, will tampering, and attempted abuse of a protected adult. Claire's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Her face was pale, lips pressed into a tight line. She barely reacted as Delaney guided her hands behind her back, clicking the cuffs with a practiced motion. Ethan stood by the fireplace, arms crossed, as if he wanted to shrink into the brickwork. He didn't move to stop the officers. He didn't look at Claire. He just stood there, eyes on the floor, silent, while the world he'd let happen began to unravel in front of him. Officer Delaney spoke quietly with Henry, then handed me a copy of the report, my name spelled out in careful block letters at the top, charges listed underneath. We'll be in touch, Delaney said before leading Claire out the front door and down the walk to the waiting car. The house felt different right away, emptier, lighter, as if some unseen weight had finally shifted. I sat down at the kitchen table, my hands resting on the polished wood, the afternoon sun bright on my skin. Ethan lingered in the hallway for a while, finally coming to stand by the window, grocery bag dangling from his fingers. Mom, he said quietly, I didn't know. I turned toward him, studying the lines in his face, the worry behind his eyes. You didn't want to know. I answered, my voice calm. He set the bag on the counter, lemon tea, a bunch of flowers, 2 apples. I just thought I thought you needed help. I nodded, not saying more. That evening, I sat with a cup of tea, real tea, brewed with my own hands, the scent curling through the kitchen. The house was quiet, except for the soft creak of the floor and the distant hum of traffic. I wrote a letter to Lydia telling her about the day's events and thanking her for her support through all those silent weeks. Before bed, I opened the drawer where I kept the old notebook and slipped in the official report, my story, and the record of what had been done. The next day, the courthouse was filled with an uneasy hush. Claire's lawyer was waiting in the hallway, face drawn and tired. The judge reviewed the evidence again, original trust psychiatric reports, Claire's own words on tape documents stamped with official seals. Claire sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed straight ahead. She wore no jewelry, no hint of the pearls she'd once favored. The judge's voice was level as he read the ruling, barring her from all future access to my estate and referring the matter to the district attorney for prosecution. When it was over, I stood holding the paper in my hands. Henry walked beside me out of the courtroom, quiet as ever, nodding to the clerk and thanking the judge. Reporters waited by the courthouse steps, their questions tumbling into the morning air. Henry answered for me, firm and polite, while I watched the clouds move across the sky. I wanted nothing but to go home, to feel the doorknob cool beneath my palm, to walk through each room and know that for the first time in months, every corner truly belonged to me. That afternoon, I updated my will, removing both Ethan and Claire's names, writing in Lydia's instead. I called a local agency and arranged for a part-time caretaker, someone I picked myself, a woman named Joni, with a gentle laugh and quick wit. The first thing we did together was open the windows, letting in the late spring breeze. I watched Joni dust the mantel, her movements brisk and sure. She didn't ask questions, just listened as I explained the changes and what I needed from now on. In the evenings, I cooked simple meals, walked around the backyard, and watered the tomatoes growing by the old shed. The air felt clearer, lighter, as if the house itself had been waiting for the door to open, for laughter to return that wasn't forced or cautious. I wrote one more letter to Henry, thanking him for standing by me when it mattered most, and tucked it into the pile of documents in the bottom drawer. The days moved quietly, each one marked by small victories, a meal, shared a phone call with Lydia, a fresh page in my notebook. Even the wisteria seemed to bloom brighter, trailing over the fence in a cascade of purple and green. Sometimes I'd pause by the back gate and look out at the street, feeling the peace that came from knowing the worst was over. But I also knew there was still one chapter left, a final reckoning, and a lesson to carry forward, one I would write myself on my own terms, in my own voice. The weeks that followed brought a new kind of quiet to my life. With Claire gone and Ethan's visits fading into memory, the house settled into itself, each room slowly breathing out the tension that had held it for so long. I spent my mornings with a cup of coffee by the kitchen window, watching the sun climb over the rooftops, the world outside soft and familiar. Joni, my new caretaker, arrived each afternoon, her laughter filling the spaces that had once echoed with uncertainty. She helped me plant tomatoes along the fence and sometimes stayed for supper, her stories easy and warm. Lydia called, often checking in from Ohio, never asking for anything, just listening, just being there. One Saturday, she drove all the way across 3 states to sit beside me on the porch, our hands wrapped around matching mugs of tea. We talked about Frank and the family holidays, about the garden and the future. And I realized how grateful I was to have her in my life, someone who never once questioned my worth or tried to rewrite my story. When she left, she hugged me a little longer than usual, promising to visit again soon. I found myself reclaiming old habits. I opened the piano in the parlor and played simple tunes, fingers a bit stiff, but memory sure. I wrote letters, real letters, not legal briefs, thanking Henry for his loyalty, telling Lydia how proud I was, and even a note for Ethan wishing him peace, but making it clear my boundaries would stand. The house felt lighter, the air sweeter, as if dignity had moved back in alongside me. Looking back, I saw how easy it would have been to slip into silence to let someone else narrate the last chapters of my life. But I learned that it's never too late to speak up. Never too late to protect your own story, no matter how many times others try to erase it. Justice didn't roar in my life. It arrived quietly in the form of steady hands, honest words, and the courage to keep holding on even when the world seemed determined to let me go. There were still hard days, memories that stung, regrets that lingered. But I faced them with a kind of strength I'd forgotten I had. The garden bloomed brighter that year. The tomatoes flourished in the summer sun. Sometimes, as the evening settled in, I'd sit by the window with a notebook and let myself remember every victory, big and small. If you've ever wondered whether your voice still matters or if standing your ground is worth the risk, I hope you know you're not alone. Dignity is a quiet thing, but it's also unbreakable. We each have a right to our own story to be seen, to be heard, and to carry forward the pieces of ourselves no one else can steal. Thank you for listening to my story. If it meant something to you, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you've found your own strength along the way, I'd love to know, leave a comment, or just take a moment to reflect. We're stronger together, one honest story at a time.